So, Prolegomena. 1. Contextualizing evidence. So, this is one of the biggest problems in this topic. So, categories and interpretive lenses of evidence are established by prior sources. That's what we must do. This is necessary and very helpful because we are dealing with concepts, institutions, and literary sources from a specific religious group in a very specific period. That is the early Christians from the 1st and 2nd century. And so it is necessary that our categories are actually defined by those sources, if of course they can define them, which I'm going to show that they actually can. Basic definitions, granted, but still good category establishment nonetheless. So, for example, early sources X and Y establish these categories that allow us to interpret the later source Z. And this is a key problem in these discussions, and I will say especially for the Romanists, although Protestants aren't free of this either. Protestants can make some pretty big slip-ups in this as well, where they will primarily resort to what they currently understand as the idea of a bishop, for example, or a presbyter, or apostolic succession. This is really the core problem of this entire debate. And then they'll say, "Oh, look at that! So now we're going to read this source, and oh, look at that! They mention this word which is used for the category I know, so therefore my category applies." And this very often happens without people noticing. Even otherwise highly educated people, like certain Roman apologists, like I'll just name them straight up: Joe Heschmeyer, not as he doesn't really deal with this as much, but kind of Michael Lofton, Swan Sonner, Trent Horn, pretty much all of them when they delve into this, because they have to do that. And this is not, if any of you guys are watching, that's not shade. That's genuine critique. Love you guys. You're awesome. Especially Swan. Really intelligent guy, younger than me. Freaking awesome lad. But yeah, there's mistakes that are made, and it's unfortunate. So we must, and that is what this presentation does, work with the categories that these sources themselves are working with. And what's especially helpful for this is that there is an objective set of texts upon which everyone, including the authors of later sources themselves, base their beliefs on, and that is the apostolic text. And so we are able to get their categories, and then diachronically go through the historical record, see how they're used, how they possibly change, because this is an important thing too. The opposite problem is also possible, where you establish your categories historically, but then you're so rigid with them that you end up forcing later sources that otherwise do genuinely change things up and forcing them into that lens and then coming up to an incorrect conclusion. And so we have to avoid that extreme either as well. And yes, we'll see that in today's presentation as well. Number 2, kinds of evidence. So another issue, I'm going to distinguish between evidence and compatible data. So, evidence points specially towards and or against a certain hypothesis. For example, water all over the ground. So, and I don't just mean like on a specific section, but like everywhere, like on your front porch, on the road, in the grass and all that. Water all over that prefers a recent rain, as in rain just recently fell, over someone spilling liters upon gallons and gallons of cups of water across those areas. The rain hypothesis is much simpler, makes much more sense of it. Requires less assumptions than someone just constantly spilling water in such a short period of time. So that's an example of evidence. Compatible data is compatible with a hypothesis, but does not necessitate it or strongly prefer it over another. So, for example, a puddle of water in a shaded front deck is maybe compatible with recent rain, assuming the angle of the deck isn't too sharp. But it's also compatible with someone spilling a cup of water. So this is kind of akin to circumstantial evidence in law. And yeah, all data fits on some kind of spectrum between these categories. And I want to add as well, there is sometimes data that's just straight up evidence. But yeah, we're dealing qualitatively here, not quantitatively. Like data, evidence and data, historical sources don't come with little numbers that define mathematically their evidential rating. That's not how it works. We're dealing with qualitative data, so we use qualitative method. And yeah, so big problem in the online discussions is how this distinction is very rarely appreciated. So again, I'll point to the Romanist, where they'll sometimes say, yes, okay, look, so it's true that, let's say, the Shepherd of Hermas, it mentions multiple elders and all that stuff. Okay, We'll say that that's true. But that's not incompatible with a monarchical episcopate. There could be one of those elders who's superior to all the others. And so therefore the monarchical episcopate, yeah, we got evidence for it. or at bare minimum. So it's an acceptable way of looking at this. Yeah, so this does happen. Not crazy often, thankfully, but it does sometimes happen where compatible data can sometimes be conflated as direct evidence, which is bad. Thankfully, again, not insanely common. Okay, I have to highlight this. CSI Ancient Church. Ain't that true? Ain't that absolutely true? But yes, so even if one grants that you can say, hey, look, this is compatible, this thing is compatible, this source rather is compatible with my hypothesis, and all that does at best is establish that you don't have a defeater. Congratulations, your hypothesis can account for it. That's not evidence for your hypothesis. And this is why it's so important to establish what the categories that these sources are working with at the outset. All right. Because it could still end up becoming the case that even if your hypothesis is technically compatible with most or even all the data, if your hypothesis throws in categories and assumptions that are otherwise never attested when they should be expected, that does end up being a form of cumulative evidence against the hypothesis. But again, we'll get into that later. So a little bit more compatible data. Not enough to draw a technical compatibility between the words in a source, especially if they're translated, and a hypothesis, but a conceptual compatibility in essential elements. This is key. Really, really, really key. It goes on what I just said. So perfect example, person A says, beans are healthy for you. And then he cites person B as support, who says the exact same words, beans are healthy for you. But with further context, you end up seeing that person B is referring to canned beans, while person A is referring to jelly beans. So they are saying two very different things with the same word. Very key, very key. Keep that in mind once we get to the discussions on bishop, episcopos, etc. Look at any number of Roman apologetics videos on this very topic, and you'll see what I mean. You'll see what I mean. So number 4, direct versus indirect contradiction. This is going to be key for the value evaluation at the end of this. So necessary distinction. Direct contradiction is one piece of data directly contradicts a hypothesis or a necessary element of such. So not something that might be expected, but is actually necessary to the hypothesis. So example number 1, hypothesis, every single swan in Australia is white. Data, one or more black swans in Australia. Direct contradiction, no way around it. Example number 2, if this clump is sodium, it will react with water. Data, the clump does not react with water. So a necessary element of the hypothesis is that the clump will react to water. And because it doesn't, that necessary consequence of the hypothesis is refuted. And then by extension, the hypothesis itself is refuted. Now, an indirect contradiction this is actually where most of the discussion is going to be over. Virtually all the discussion is going to be over. And it's much more, it's a bit more tricky and involved. So that's when data appears to present a different reality to what the hypothesis expects without strictly denying the core. So this can be far trickier. Well, I say far trickier, but depends on the context. Can be far trickier to demonstrate and does require a lot of extra care. Works very closely with the argument from silence, which I'll address in a second. And there can be varying levels of indirect contradiction. So one example is hypothesis, Thomas the Tank Engine is Mark's favorite toy. And the data is Mark has consistently played with Action Man more than Thomas. Now, whatchamacallit? Thomas the Tank Engine. Hang on, my mind went blank. Sorry. So Mark consistently playing with Thomas the Tank Engine more than Action Man is more expected, is something that is expected, we can say, for all else being equal, key emphasis, all else being equal, that this is expected if Thomas the Tank Engine is Mark's favorite toy. But it's not strictly necessary to the theory because there may be another factor for why that is the case. Nonetheless, absent any other such factor, you can say on a probabilistic level that Thomas the Tank Engine is not Mark's favorite toy. Probably. Anyway. So, next. Number 5 on silence. Poorly understood across the board. almost no discussion on the proper criteria for science. I say almost none because some people start to talk about it a little bit more, but I like to emphasize it a lot because it is actually a key tool of history, and it just drives me up the wall when I hear time and time again people just say, oh, that's an argument from science. That's an argument from science. And then go on to use one themselves. So we need to establish when is science significant and when is it a nothing burger, right? Whatchamacallit. So my criteria are as follows. First, the author would have known of the given idea or the hypothesis. And two, the author would have certainly mentioned it in the text in question, given the circumstances. And this I mainly get from A Guide to Historical Method by Father Gilbert Garrigan. Fantastic book. Good luck finding it, but it is great stuff. And there's a sub-criteria I have to point number 2, which I learned from Dr. David Falk in my interview with him. That is not strictly necessary, but it helps a lot. A lot. So the author makes mention of a different idea in place of the one in question. So it doesn't have to necessarily be a contradictory idea, just a different idea. So you expect in this text, in this context, that an author will make mention or use of an idea, concept, whatever, and rather than actually mention it at all, they actually mention or make else of a different concept altogether. And this will be something that we end up seeing later on in the presentation. So something else also to consider is cumulative silences. So consistent silences where a proposed idea, I'll say, should be present or at minimum expected to be present, even if on an individual case-by-case level, the source can be technically reconciled with the data. But altogether, a accumulation of silences can grow into a powerful silence in itself. So, and this is likewise the case with many soft, or I meant to say indirect contradictions. So multiple indirect contradictions, even if case by case can be resolved, can end up forming a larger argument, a larger reason against a certain hypothesis. Here's interesting. So as stated, hypothesis example 2 is technically still plausible since it's stated as a conditional. So the hypothesis itself is that the clump is sodium. So I do word it as if the clump is sodium, it will react with water. The clump does not react with water. So, okay, so I might have worded that a little bit wrong, but I'm supposed to say reword it as the clump is sodium, and as a necessary consequence, it will react with water. And then the data is the clump does not react with water. Therefore, the hypothesis is, yeah, that's true. Sorry, I stated it as a conditional. Technically, this conditional is correct. But so I word it as an absolute. So the clump is sodium, it will react with water. So mean it like that. And yes, autism in G, but it's good autism. Thank you very much. Thank you for pointing that out, mine, Ben. I will probably edit the slide after this. Okay, now number 6 this is another big one too, particularly from Romanists. And you know what? I think they do have good points here. I think there's consistently too much skepticism from the Protestant side. So trusting of certain sources, in this case, particularly Irenaeus and Hegesippus, is central to this debate. Okay, but consistent historical method must trust an authenticated source until given good reason to the contrary. That's key, because the only other two options we have is either to default to skepticism, which would then eviscerate all historical knowledge that we have, because fundamentally with all forms of communication, we place a fairly significant degree of trust, and not for bad reason at all, because generally, just from experience, generally humans are honest and our senses are reliable. If they weren't, just in everyday communication, for example, and messaging and all that stuff, if they weren't, our civilization would collapse. Simple as that. And then the other way to go is that you arbitrarily choose what sources to trust and to distrust at the outset. That's the atheist polemicist against Holy Scripture. We are historians. There's a wide chasm of difference between them. So we're not going to do that. And so the only consistent historical method, and really not just historical method, but just means of basic human investigation, relationship, all that stuff, is to trust a source until given good reason to the contrary. That reason can take many forms. That can take the form of evidence. It can take the form of evaluating the circumstances and all, and seeing that given these conditions doesn't seem quite right what the source is saying, all that jazz. So we have to start with trust, and that's what I will be doing. Sources should therefore be trusted on claims until given good reason to the contrary. Moderate attempts to reconcile sources' intention is also necessary, permissible, and all that, until the point where the reconciliation does violence to the text or the context, in which case you will be forced to admit, okay, this source got something wrong. So that's pretty simple in my opinion. And so the Romanists will probably like this because, as I said, lots and lots and lots of Protestants love to cast a ton of shade on Irenaeus, for example. Not without cause entirely, because he does get some things wrong. Yeah, one big thing in particular with the age of Jesus. Nonetheless, he went to Rome. He conversed with many people. He lives very close to the apostles. He is still nonetheless a very valuable source. Without good reason to the contrary, we should trust what he says. Simple as that. Now, 7, another big one, against supposition. There's a lot of unwarranted appeals to supposition in this topic. Again, from the Romanists. I have to say, I'm really sorry. Because tell me if this sounds familiar. Well, this text could be reconciled with X if we suppose Y and maybe Z, A, B, C, D, and all that stuff. With X being the hypothesis and Y being an assumption that's not warranted by the text. And I'll add also the context. So that could include prior texts that establish categories and all that. And at best, this works for removing defeaters. At best, that's it. If warranted by other evidence, or if not, perhaps at least not contradicted. Which, again, there's direct contradiction, indirect contradiction, all that stuff. So, without such, the supposition is pure fideism. There's no way around that. A conclusion in search for evidence. And I see that a lot, unfortunately. Now, this presentation is returning ad fontes and building understanding from there. Ad fontes, that is to the sources. We are returning to the sources and building our categories, our assumptions from there. And as a result, this is something I am calling on everybody in this chat to do. Clear your minds of prior presuppositions, of prior rather categories, assumptions, and all that on the issue of monarchic bishops versus plural bishops versus apostolic succession, all that stuff. Clear your mind of these. We are doing a fresh look at these sources. And God willing, that should reveal a thing or two for all of us here. It will be nice and enlightening because I'm certain myself, like, even though I've looked at all this stuff quite a bit before, which is why I've been able to put this together much quicker than otherwise I would have. Nonetheless, doing this full diachronic method has opened up my mind's eye a little bit more and shown, things aren't as obvious in this as is the case as was previously supposed, or this is actually a little bit more obvious than I thought, and all that stuff. Diachronic investigation, beautiful that way, absolutely beautiful. Now, final preliminaries, I'll be posting the full bibliography and editions of primary sources sometime after this presentation.